All right, so let's go ahead and kick it off. Welcome everybody to this Q&A with Director of Coded Bias, Shalini Kantaya. Shalini, it's wonderful to be here with you this evening, even though we're not in the same place. So welcome and thank you for being with us. By way of introduction,
for having me, by the way.
Absolutely. Yeah, and by way of introduction, Shalini is the Director of Coded Bias, which premiered at the 2020 Sundance Film Festival. She's directed for the National Geographic television series Breakthrough, which was executive produced by Ron Howard and broadcast globally in June of 2017. Her debut, Catching the Sun, premiered at the LA Film Festival and was named a New York Times Critics' Pick. Catching the Sun was released globally on Netflix on Earth Day 2016 with executive producer Leonardo DiCaprio and was nominated for the Environmental Media Association Award of Best Documentary. Shalini is a TED Fellow, a Fulbright Scholar, and an associate of the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. So welcome. It's quite a resume. So Shalini, I wanted to start at how you initially became interested in the ethics of tech and AI, which of course Coded Bias is focused upon. And this is a profoundly impactful film. As I mentioned, when I saw it a couple weeks ago, it actually blew my mind and I couldn't believe that I hadn't seen it yet. I'm so glad it's on Netflix and widely available now. It really sheds light on the challenges that stereotypes and cognitive biases that we live with every day that can often feel and seem invisible, introduce into AI, which is playing a greater and greater role in governing our everyday lives. And it also illuminates how biases get coded into AI and how that extends beyond just the use of our phones or computers into many aspects of our lives, and will continue to do so. Of course, we loved your subject, Joy Buolamwini. Am I getting that correct? Buolamwini, great. Which is also, she was an incredible subject for the film, just brilliant, passionate, poetic. I thought it was interesting. She comes from such a technical background. And of course, it's the profound experience she has with facial recognition technology, not identifying her face, but identifying a white plastic mask that catalyzed her foray into a more social orientation of researching AI and bias in AI. I also think it's worth noting that ethical and social implications around AI are kind of, for the first time, being considered scientific, technical research. So this is something of a new space, even though it's been happening for a while. So I'm curious, how was it that you were initially introduced to these issues or alerted on these issues? And how did you initially connect with Joy and her work?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for hosting this conversation. It's really my deep belief that conversations like this one spark the kind of change that we need in the world. And I'm so grateful to everyone joining on this very hot day in August to be part of this conversation. I think that and I just want to note that I'm especially happy to talk to leaders of startup because I feel like startup culture and filmmaker culture are very similar. We're sort of scrappy with big visions about the world. So I'm especially grateful to speak to this audience. I think it's really important to say that 3 years ago, I didn't even know what an algorithm was. My street cred in the game is really that I'm a science fiction fanatic and have this fascination with the near future as sort of a centerpiece of my imagination. I'm always thinking about what the world will be like in 5 minutes. And I stumbled down the rabbit hole when I read a book called Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill. And I don't really think that my background as a science fiction fanatic really prepared me to understand the ways in which artificial intelligence, machine learning, algorithms are increasingly becoming almost this invisible gatekeeper of opportunity, deciding really important things like who gets hired, who gets what quality of healthcare, even how long a prison sentence someone may serve. And at the same time, I was sort of grappling with the ways in which we as human beings are outsourcing our decision making to machines in ways that really change lives and shape human destinies, I came across the work of Joy Buolamwini in a TED talk that she'd given, and was completely sort of shocked to learn that these same systems that we are putting our blind faith in have not been vetted for racial bias or for gender bias, or even more broadly, that they won't hurt people, that they won't cause harm, that they won't have unintended consequences. And in many cases, they haven't even been vetted against some shared standard of accuracy outside from the companies that stand to benefit economically from their deployment. And that's what when I began to realize what Joy articulates so clearly in Coded Bias, which is that we could essentially roll back 50 years of civil rights advances in the name of trusting these algorithms to be fair, to be neutral, to be unbiased, to be just, when in many cases that just isn't a fact. And that sort of set me on the journey to make the film.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, of course, Kathy O'Neill makes many debuts in the film. She's a fascinating professional and person. I have not personally read her book, but it's really interesting that both you and Joy kind of entered this world through her work. So clearly, she's moving the needle with the problem she's identified.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to jump a little bit right into the film. So the film weaves together a number of storylines. We have Joy and her colleagues working in the US, the Big Brother Watch organization that's located in the UK and focused there. And then the one I found really interesting, I mean, they're all very interesting, but the one that kind of piqued my interest, and I'm curious around the decisions to include this storyline, it was sort of the average civilians or people in China, and giving us a glimpse into how they're using AI on a very regular basis, and how, the attitude in that storyline was, this is being increasingly, the status quo is being increasingly accepted, and there are benefits to this. So can you give us kind of a peek behind the curtain at some of the discussions that were had about stories to include? And I'd also be curious, like, were there other storylines that were considered but didn't quite make the cut?
Yes, I mean, I think in some ways it would have been much easier for me to make a film just about facial recognition. And you sort of see in the opening of the film where Joy puts on a white mask and it doesn't see her face. What was so troubling to me in that realization was that this was not a technology that was being beta tested somewhere. This facial recognition technology was actively being sold to our FBI, actively being sold to ICE, actively being sold and deployed, oftentimes in secret, by law enforcement all across the country. And all of this was happening without anyone that we elected giving any government oversight. It was essentially big tech selling in racially biased invasive surveillance technology to law enforcement with no one that we elected giving any oversight. And when I began to explore, sort of the use and deployment of artificial intelligence, you almost can't do that without looking at the two superpowers of the US and China. And the ways in which, as Amy Webb sort of situates, there are 9 companies in the US and China that have gotten a 20-year head start on our data collection. And I sort of focused on facial recognition because this was such a hard story to tell. And in some ways, facial recognition is sort of the most visceral. The way these algorithms work feels the most invasive. It feels the easiest for all of us to understand that it's uniquely identifiable with us as a person and the abuses that it can have in the context of a democracy. And yet our data more broadly can be used in all of these ways, like facial recognition. to really create a unique psychological profile of who we are, and to sort of target us by name in all these different ways. And so I thought it was important to look at China, both in the sense of the story of Hong Kong and the ways in which people really were resisting facial recognition. I had never seen an umbrella used in such an interesting way to sort of block facial recognition, how that was such a tool in sort of pro-democracy movements in Hong Kong, but also to look at the way China's using it. The film really looks at three different approaches to data protection. The scene shot in the UK, which was at the time part of Europe and subject to the GDPR and had some protections in place that maybe could be regulated a little bit more, but really has given us a framework for putting data rights in a human rights framework. The US, which is essentially a wild, wild west, while we're home to these technology companies, we really have not regulated the sector. It really, I liken it to an automotive industry before you had a car seat for your baby and seatbelt laws. It's sort of like having a pharmaceutical industry with no counterindications and no usage directions. We are living in that kind of wild, wild west in this unregulated industry here in the US. And then looked at China, which is sort of giving us a glimpse of what happens when you have an authoritarian regime that has unfettered access to citizen data and what can happen in that framework. And what was so interesting to me are the ways in which China is using facial recognition in combination with a social credit score to sort of figure out who gets rights and freedoms and who doesn't. And at the same time, I think we in the West like to think of China as a galaxy far, far away, but I really saw it as a mirror. Because how many times have we judged someone based on how many Instagram followers they have, or wanting to delete something based on, how many Facebook likes we get? And I really thought it was a way of the way in which we have this algorithmic obedience training, as Kathy O'Neill calls it, and the way that these algorithmic systems are really reshaping behavior. And while, I sort of profile this skateboarder who's like not up in arms about the social credit score and facial recognition. And I feel like that's a mirror, because I guess there's part of me that says, wow, I could buy a candy bar with my face. How cool would that be? I could go to dinner and not have to carry credit cards. I could just pay for dinner with my face. And at the same time, not looking at what we're losing of our humanity and our democratic freedoms in this rush to efficiency. And I think when we talk, when technology leaders often talk about tech, they talk about efficiency as if it were the goal of our society. And I think in the making of this film, I really began to grapple with what it means to be human and what is the goal of human civilization. And is it to be as efficient and to go as fast as possible? Or is it to build a society that really respects the inherent value of every human being? And I think if it's the latter, then it really reshapes how we build technological systems. And I just want to say that I'm making a film now about TikTok, and that skateboarder in China who's happy to judge someone based on their social credit score, that they are more like Generation Z than anything else. Like, I've been astounded to talk to so many Gen Z youth who are more like that citizen of China who says, what is privacy? I grew up online and we give this up, and this is sort of the brave new world that we're living in. And so they've really been working on this film about TikTok has really been eye-opening to see, that this new generation really thinks about privacy and democratic freedom in an entirely different way.
It's really interesting. I mean, yeah, to your point, it's what has been normalized. This is very incremental, right? To get us to the point where we are now. I appreciated that you included that storyline because there's sort of two waves happening at once, and we shouldn't sit back and be like, oh, Joy's got this under control.
Mhm.
Even though there's a resistance to this, um, there's still broad increasing acceptance. And sometimes we're doing it without even realizing that we're signing off on, giving up some of our privacy or um, investing in these types of tools that are gaining more and more power. Um,
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is kind of the terrifying part of this, is that often people ask me what individually they can do. And we've now seen, even with the pandemic, has only heightened our reliance on these technological systems. I mean, this is the only way we can be together today. And I don't know if you checked the terms and conditions of Zoom before you logged in. I did not. And we are now in this situation where you have to choose. You shouldn't have to choose, really, between whether your child gets to go to math class and whether your child's biometric data, or they're like having invasive surveillance in their homes by a private company who then has this data for life that they have no rules around how they can use. And I think that is really the terrifying world that we're living in. And I think that, oftentimes I've heard, prior to making this film, these issues being framed around privacy. And to me, privacy is sort of an unemotional word that I have kind of a disconnection from. It kind of it seems like a nice to have.
yeah,
And I think the word is really that is more accurate is invasive surveillance. And just how much invasive surveillance, be it by private companies, um, or by the state, that we're now willingly surrendering our data to. And the other thing I didn't realize, and I sort of touched on it before, is what a complete psychological profile can be built about us based on our data online, because our data is being bought and sold by all of these brokers because we have no laws about where our data is coming from. And you saw with the Cambridge Analytica scandal that a foreign company built a psychological profile of the 100,000 voters, that 100,000 people that it believed to have the psychological profile of a swing voter,
mhm.
and began to target them incessantly with all kinds of misinformation and sort of emotionally stimulating content to get them to vote. And so you can see how that can happen. And we're living in an age where the most powerful tools are being garnered, to sell us potato chips at the time it can tell by our sporadic behavior online that we have low blood sugar and we're diabetic. And, that's the kind of ways in which we're all vulnerable to the predatory use of this technology.
Yeah. And I think that gets into sort of who's responsible for oversight, which obviously there's no answer to this yet, but I'm curious to get your thoughts and see how your thinking has evolved since you started becoming a student of this space. So in the film, of course, Joy was able to claim victory over Amazon, but these are tech giants with a lot at stake. I did see, separate from the film, that Dr. Timnit Gebru, who does make an appearance in the film, Joy's colleague, was basically forced out of Google for her research related to ethics and language models. And that happened in December of 2020. But at the same time, and she had kind of uh, developed this space of AI ethics and studying it seriously at Google, and has done a lot of amazing work there. At the same time, we're seeing big tech companies like Salesforce, for instance, just appointed a chief of ethics, Paula Goldman, who we'll be speaking with in a couple months. And they're building out that department. So there's a big investment going into an ethics initiative at the company. So, of course, these are mixed signals, but, what you're seeing out there, does it leave you feeling optimistic about the future and our ability to get ahead of monitoring AI so that it works for everyone?
I think that what I'm optimistic about is the power of our voices in this space. And I think that we have a moonshot moment, that this is sort of that pivotal moment to push for greater ethics in the technologies that will ultimately reshape our democracy and and really forge the future. I think that what I've learned is that everything we love as free people living in a democracy, fair housing, fair employment, equal rights, will be transformed by artificial intelligence, and that we, the people, have to have a place at the table because these technologies intersect with every right and freedom that we enjoy. And so to me, I feel that we can't paint all companies with one brush. What if anything, has made me hopeful, it's that I've seen sea change in the making of Coded Bias that I never thought possible. First of all, it's important to say that I made Coded Bias to invite us all to have a seat at the table. I think when it comes to artificial intelligence, all of the knowledge has been in the hands of the few. So all of the power has been in the hands of the few. And one of the things I hope Coded Bias does is pull up a seat for all of us at the table to say that we all should have some common language. A 10-year-old is going to start using a phone, a smartphone in the 5th grade. It's that age that they should start learning about data collection. And while they're getting one ad and their classmate is getting another ad, I'm a big proponent of just mass scale AI literacy in our schools, not only because it is a massive, it is the technology that will redefine the future, as they call data is the new oil, but because it will give us the power to question these technologies. And you see in the stories of people who successfully challenged this new opaque form of power, they first had to understand it, and it can be really overwhelming. And I'm so grateful to the cast of the film to give me an education, because now I can start to see what might be a legitimate use of artificial intelligence and what is bogus pseudoscience being, a bag of tricks being peddled by a private corporation that is not founded in science. Like these companies that say, like, we can judge if someone's going to be a good candidate based on their facial expressions. That's like complete bogus pseudoscience. And now I can sort of call baloney on that, and only because I've had this education that we should all have. So I believe that that will empower us to sort of question these opaque systems. What I've seen, and I that being said, every major company except for Amazon has hosted a screening of Coded Bias, and that gives me a lot of a hope that there are good people, conscientious people, even brilliant people who are working within these companies who know this is a problem and want to solve it. And that gives me a lot of hope. That being said, I've seen a pattern of big tech discrediting and dismissing independent research that shines a light on bias, like the firing of Dr. Timnit Gebru, before there is a groundswell of people's support. And you saw with the firing of Google's lead AI ethicist, Dr. Timnit Gebru, over an ethics issue, that 2,500 of her colleagues did a virtual walkout, and there were resignations that followed in the midst. And that gives me hope, because that's how things change. But it's important to say that after that the sea change that I never thought was possible was that IBM said that they were getting out of the facial recognition game. They put their money where their ethics are, and they shut down shop. They said, we won't research it, we won't deploy it, we won't sell it, we're done. And I thought that was an unprecedented step towards a company taking ethics seriously. Microsoft said that they would not sell facial recognition to law enforcement, and Amazon, following suit as good measure, took a 1-year pause, which ended a month ago, and I'm waiting to see what they do.
Oh, interesting.
And I think that sea change took place because of brave scientists like Joy Buolamwini, like Dr. Timnit Gebru, like Kathy O'Neill, who are shining a light on these issues unencumbered by corporate interest. And we need these sort of outside ethicists to shine a light in these places. I think it says a lot that 3 Black women sort of shine a light on bias in artificial intelligence and discovered racial bias in facial recognition that somehow IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon missed. And if that's not a rally cry for greater inclusion and diversity in the rooms where these decisions are being made, I don't know what is.
Well, on the basis of Joy's story, this wasn't like a small miss.
Yes.
This was like a swing and a miss. It didn't see her face as a human face. It wasn't just a misidentification.
No, it showed a white mask, which is not like anyone's face, right?
Right.
And I think that that's really important because, the cast of my film, I didn't set out to make a film that was mostly people of color, mostly women, but my research kept taking me back to these voices. And what I realized is what is common to the cast of Coded Bias is not only are they some of the foremost scholars in their field and some of the smartest human beings I've ever spoken to, advanced degrees from Harvard and Stanford and every other major AI university, but also had an experience that was marginalized. They were women, they were people of color, they were religious minorities, they were queer. And because of that, they had an experience that wasn't centered. And one of the things that I've grown in compassion for is that we as humans all have bias. Bias is not just in a few bad law enforcement officers. It's not in a few bad white men. It's in all of us, regardless of our demographic and how we grew up. And that essentially means that we perpetually have to be hyper vigilant about controlling for bias in the design and deployment of these technologies. And that means that working in inclusive teams, and by inclusive, I mean not just demographic and, race, class, gender, and all sexual orientation, all the things, but also maybe not everyone goes to Stanford. Maybe you need some people from San Jose State. Maybe you need some, there has to be all kinds of, maybe you need a crazy liberal arts person in the room, an outside ethicist, some interdisciplinary approaches to design, to control for bias, to think about the Black Mirror episode that you didn't foresee.
Yep.
And I think that is part of the way that we make change. And I just want to say that those 3 companies also made that unprecedented change in June 2020. And that was really important because that was when you had really tens of thousands of people all across the country people of all colors locking arms and being in the streets, pushing to fight against racial bias. And that is important because I feel like it really takes, brave scientists unencumbered by corporate interests. It takes massive science communication. Hopefully the film played some small role in translating how these systems work. It can't be just people with PhDs that understand this stuff. And then it took a groundswell of ordinary people in the streets saying we can do better, and pushing those companies to bring more of their humanity to the table. And I think that moved the needle, and that really gives a recipe to all of us about what makes change possible.
Yeah,
And so the answer to your question is it's up to us. Whether we're hopeful is really up to us to make some sort of change.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested. So you get into, we're touching on the racial justice movement now. These stories can be dry if they're not told through film, right? That's the beauty of a medium like film. You're an incredible storyteller. You tell this story so eloquently, and it uncovers so many technical things involved in this invisible kind of ether that affects our lives every day. But you get into the technical aspects of why it looks that way, how that happened. And it's incredibly engaging in a way that if I read a white paper about, racial bias and gender bias in AI, facial recognition technology, it might not have the same profound impact on me. And so, clearly film seems like a wonderful way to marry your interests as a storyteller in social justice. And so I'm just curious, like what's keeping you inspired about these stories and using film as your storytelling medium? And kind of, yeah, what are you looking at right now?
Well, I just want to say I really appreciate that because I couldn't talk to people at parties for 2 years because I was so worried they'd ask me what I was making a film about. And I was like, I'm making a film about racist robots and like how they can replicate human bias. And all of a sudden I see their eyes glaze over and I was alone at the punch bowl. And
it can only be told through film and documentary. There's certain topics.
And I think often we talk about technology without talking about humanity. And I think one of the things that I really seek to do is really put human beings at the center of the story of technology and how it intersects with the most vulnerable among us. And I think that one of the things I also sought to do is show human agency, because I mean, I worked on films about, Catching the Sun was about the possibility of building a clean energy economy. So I'm, no stranger to sort of speaking truth to power to, in whether it be the fossil fuel industry or other industries. Although I often try to be solution oriented and not point fingers, because anyway, but I think that what is common is that I tend to look for people that we're cheering for. And I think the characters in the film all have agency, whether it's the Brooklyn residents who got their landlord who didn't even know what biometric data was. And when their landlord tried to install it, and not only did they organize their friends and neighbors and keep, this racially biased invasive surveillance being installed in the place where they live, but they also inspired the first legislation in the state of New York that would protect other residents from doing the same. Or Daniel Santos, who organized with other teachers, to come up with a more humane way of judging whether a teacher is a good teacher. And so I tend to, in film, look for the human stories and really look for people that we're cheering for instead of sort of systems that we want to tear down, because I find it's more easy to be critical than to be hopeful. And I think that hope is really the revolutionary act.
Well, and it goes back to something you've mentioned multiple times in this conversation, human connection, and that kind of serving as the basis or the purpose for this work anyway. I mean, you're taking on really big issues like renewable energy, big companies that are behind this stuff, big tech, and telling a story that has not been heard very widely, and is controversial at the time. It's not immediately widely accepted. There's a lot of pushback because these companies have a lot at stake. So it's pretty amazing that to hear that you find your inspiration from individual stories.
Absolutely.
Um, and I'm curious. I mean, we've kind of already glossed over this, but I'm sure you've spent a lot of time thinking about it. If you wanted every viewer to walk away with one thing, one nugget from your film, what would that message be?
Well, I think that uh, you can go to codedbias.com and there's a take action page. And I think the one thing that I would want people to take away is that data rights are human rights, that data rights intersect with all of our freedoms that we enjoy, the right to assemble, the freedom of speech, freedom of press, so many things that we hold dear, and they're transforming our democracy. And that means that we all have to participate in their protection. And it's my belief, and I feel this way whether we're talking about fossil fuel or whether we're talking about I'm a big believer that limitations can spark innovation, that limitations and rules can spark new types of imagination. As a filmmaker, I'm working within the confines of like a very small budget or whatever I'm working with. And that unleashes a new type of imagination about how I approach my story. And it's my belief that when we make the limitations around our civil rights, when we make the limitations around protecting the most vulnerable among us, that we can create new kinds of technologies. And I will say that I think that there's been a stunning lack of imagination about how AI can be used, because we are essentially using it in this sort of predatory model, this like invasive surveillance model to target people, to say, exactly what you said, that you have a gambling habit and I'm just going to push discount tickets to Vegas for you at the time that you're most manic. And I can tell that. And so I think that there could be incredible uses of artificial intelligence, that we could unleash whole new ways of using algorithms and deep machine learning and AI towards a public good, but we just haven't yet unleashed that kind of imagination, because big tech has really told us that the only way this can function is in the context of what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. And I think that there could be another economic model. And I often liken surveillance capitalism to sort of fossil fuels. It's an extractive economy for which they are scraping our data in this one-sided way where we don't have, and they're benefiting economically from our data, that we have no rights, protections, or economic benefit, shared economic benefit. And I really think that that system could be game changed, and maybe some of the people on this call could use this, to use these technologies in ways that benefit the public good in ways that we've not yet imagined.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes back to what you were talking about, the educational efforts, just getting people educated on this, which your film does really well. I've been reading about responsible tech and ethical tech for a while now, and this shed whole new light on the inner workings of some of this. And as you pointed out, big tech historically has been a little bit inaccessible to the average person, because it's painted as complex, difficult, coding is its own language. a number of reasons. But I think your film really opens this up to everybody and gives people a sense of how to start tackling the problem. I do want to ask you one more question, then I'll open the floor for Q&A. So feel free to start submitting questions if you have any right now. But I didn't want to skip over the scene that I've been thinking about so much since seeing the film, from the House of Representatives facial recognition technology hearing. And I've heard you talk about that scene a little bit and how you were there at the hearing. And it sounded like you were somewhat taken aback. It was not what you were expecting going into it. And so I would love to just hear a little more about your experience there. And I'm curious if you've received any reactions from lawmakers and legislators about the film.
I think I often talk to that scene because I was sitting in the House Oversight Committee, listening to Joy testify, and I saw something that we don't see on television, which is that sometimes our government works and sometimes the left and the right agree. And I've never been more shocked in my life. And I saw right-wing Republican Jim, I'm losing his name, of Ohio, Jim Jordan of Ohio, very right-wing Republican, agree with
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Or Ocasio-Cortez of New York, very left-wing Democrat. And they both agree. And there was a moment where I heard Jim Jordan say, well, wait a minute, 117 million Americans are in a police database that can be accessed without a warrant, and no one is in an elected office is overseeing this. and hearing the Republicans sort of respond with as much sort of fear and shock about what is happening and how big tech is sort of overrunning democracy with as much fear as the Democrats, made me feel like, wow, this is somewhat hopeful. There might be some common ground in some ways that we can push ourselves to regulate this wild, wild west of big tech in the US and sort of create a framework for civil rights. And I just want to say that as much as coded bias is sort of a dark, eye-opening look down the rabbit hole of big tech, I think it's a hopeful film. And I think I make films to remind myself that everyday people can make a difference, and that not everyone not all heroes wear capes among us. And I think that our biggest obstacle is actually not big tech, but it's our own apathy and our belief that we actually can make a difference. And I think if we all did one thing, whether it's just write a quick note to our representative or go to the codedbias.com take action site and take a second to find, an Amnesty International campaign or the ACLU or Big Brother Watch or the Algorithmic Justice League, some movement that speaks to you, and take or the Data Rights as Human Rights Declaration, and just take a second to just let your voice be heard. I think if all of us did that, we could move the needle. And it's my deep belief that this is our moonshot moment to bring more of our humanity into the technologies that will govern the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I'm really glad you included that scene and that it was sort of framed the way it was, because it was a stark reminder and really underscored the fact that legislation has not kept ahead of this technology. So we cannot just sit back and assume somebody's got the reins of this thing. It was really kind of brought it all together.
Thank you. And I just want to add that Coded Bias will be screened for the Democratic caucus in October. And it's my hope maybe we can find a sponsor on the other side of the aisle to screen it to the Republican caucus. And so
that'd be amazing.
We look forward to that.
We do have a question that just came in. So Shalini, what do you think corporations should begin to address? What do you think corporations should begin to address bias in hiring? specifically in the data science space?
That is a lot. I mean, I was very alarmed in that scene with the Amazon sorting system, that so many times that there is an algorithmic, um, sort of gatekeeper in who gets hired, and the ways in which, in spite of the best intentions of the programmers, um, who had actually designed the technology to do actually the opposite, to level the playing field, and that the system picked up on who got hired in the past and who got promoted, and lo and behold began to discriminate against anyone it could discern was a woman. And I'm dismayed. And I think that what I will say broadly, as someone who's not a data scientist, but as someone who's been sitting with a lot of data scientists, is that I've learned to ask a few questions that can be helpful. And these are really things that Kathy O'Neill has shared with me. And one is to really look at, if you're using an algorithmic system, for whom could the system fail? Who could it fail on? If it fails, what are the stakes? Are you denying someone a job? Are you denying someone livelihood? How easy is it to identify that there's been a failure in the system? That goes to speak of how transparent these systems are. I was just on a panel with someone who was questioning the fact that these black box algorithms owned by private companies should be able to be analyzed by, outside third parties. And the last question is sort of around, once we know it's failed, how easy is it to correct that failure and to know that it's discriminated against someone? Is there a human in that loop who can remedy the situation? And I think that more broadly can help systems be more fair. Certainly, Kathy O'Neill has a whole company that is actually geared towards vetting systems for bias. And I think having an outside ethicist vet some of these algorithms is helpful until we have legislation that will actually compel companies to be more ethical and to have some sort of system.
Yeah, I think that's a great direction to go in, especially for companies that can't yet afford to have someone dedicated, like a chief ethics officer, fill that role yet. That's great advice. I want to continue to just kind of leave the Q&A open for anyone. And I think that, before we went live, Shalini, we were talking about early stage startup founders. And I would venture to guess that this is, if it's not totally relevant yet, the ethics of their product development and exactly how that's being implemented, it's something that's going to be relevant really quickly if they're planning to scale. So of course, at 500, we talk a lot about building that culture early on, because there's a lot of research out there that says, 15 employees is kind of the tipping point where it becomes much harder to change culture. So is there anything, that you would, any thoughts that you would leave with early stage founders as they're starting to kind of shape this culture, and in terms of like their responsibility around this? I thought those were great tips about process and resources that you just shared as well. But
I sort of think
early stage founders.
Yes, absolutely. And I love early. I feel like every film that I undertake is sort of an early stage startup that I build from scratch and sort of see into the world. And so I have a lot of respect for the work that you're doing and the many hours of burnout, of work that startups put into their work on passion. I'll say a few things. I think, what I touched on earlier is about building inclusive teams, not just in terms of race and class and gender and sexual orientation, but also in terms of interdisciplinary approaches to things and having different people in the room who can vet technologies before they're deployed at scale. I think no matter what technology that you're building, understanding what the stakes are if it goes wrong and who it could harm is just really important, because I think sometimes you want to move fast and break things. And I think that the healthier thing to do is to move slower and heal things, and try to create a culture, because once it's deployed, you have such a massive scale, and such small things in a technology really have huge ripple effects on how it's used and deployed. The other thing I want to say is that I'm so grateful for conversations like this one, and for companies who have invited me to the table, because I think it's so important to build a culture where dissent is welcomed, where dissent can actually make your technology stronger, and where someone feels comfortable saying, well, wait a minute, slow down. As Trinae Moran says, I can feel something's not right here. And we need to take a step back and make sure it's right before we go to scale. And I think that sometimes even having an anonymous box so that someone feels like they don't have to put their academic reputation on the line, their professional reputation at stake, to voice their opinion of dissent is really important in creating competitive, innovative technologies that work for everyone.
I absolutely love that. And there's a lot of great stuff out there about psychological safety and building that within teams. So thank you for leaving us with that nugget to think on as we go forward. Thank you for your film. I appreciate it so much. I know many do. And it's really impactful. And I look forward to, it's already added so much to the conversation. I look forward to how it can continue to change the world. We'll keep an eye out for it at the big political national conventions, and I'll have my fingers crossed for you there. And it was so great to connect with you. So thanks for being here tonight.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and for everyone who took the time. It's really my belief that conversations like this one actually spark and seed the change that we all need. So thank you so much for being part of it.
Wonderful. Thank you,
Thank you.
Shalini.
It was an honor. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you. Have a good one. Bye, everyone.